Good morning and welcome. I'm Faria Nasruddin, a program associate for the Wilson Center's Middle East program and the project lead for the Middle East Women's Initiative. I'm pleased to welcome you and to be moderating today's event launching the 2024 Arab Barometer's Gender Report. I'm joined today by a panel of experts, including MaryClare, the Director of Technology and Innovation at Arab Barometer and author of this report, Marissa Khurma, the Middle East Program Director here at the Wilson Center, Kristen Smith-Dewan, a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and last but not least, Safa El-Yacoubi, a policy analyst specializing in North Africa. We're here today to discuss the findings of the 8th wave of Arab Barometer's survey data, which began in September 2023 and saw data collected across Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Mauritania, Morocco, Palestine, and Tunisia from 13,000 interviews. And with that very brief introduction, I'll give it off to the author of the report to present her findings and go a lot in more detail.
Thank you, Faria. Thank you all for being here. I am MaryClare Roche. I'm with the Arab Barometer, and I'm going to be presenting the findings on the gender from our 8th wave. There's a lot more detail in the report. I will do my best to hit the highlights in this presentation. So a bit about the Arab Barometer before I begin. The Arab Barometer is the leading and most influential research network on public opinion in North Africa and the Middle East. So we started in 2006, and we are the longest standing nonprofit, nonpartisan research network hosted both at Princeton and the University of Michigan. So we aim to provide rigorous and reliable data on public attitudes towards crucial issues across the region. A big goal of ours is to empower citizens to amplify their voice in public discourse. And all of our data is publicly accessible. All of our reports are publicly accessible. There's no fee associated. You can find them all on our website, arabbarometer.org. So our mission in 3 parts is to track attitudes and behaviors of ordinary citizens across North Africa and the Middle East, to build institutional capacities with our partners in the region, and to disseminate knowledge about citizens living in MENA. A bit more about this wave in particular. So in total, there will be 8 countries. I said 7 for this slide because there are 7 countries that are covered in this report. We are currently in the process of finishing up and cleaning our data coming from Iraq. So this report focuses on 7 nationally representative surveys of citizens 18 and older. There are over 13,000 personal interviews that are all conducted in the person's residence face-to-face. We use a complex survey design stratified by governorate and urbanity, and the interviews in this report took place from September 2023 to April 2024. And we work with local partners in each country. Every enumerator, every person taking the interview, is also a citizen of that country. So some key findings that you'll find much more details about in the report, but what we cover is that pro-gender equality views have declined across the region since our last wave, which took place from 2001 to 2022. And these are trends on roles in the workplace. These are trends on women's political capacity and who has final decisions in the home. So across a pretty broad range of topics. We also find that many women who have had jobs in the past, those who now identify as students, as housewives, as unemployed, do want to return to work in the future. But there are many more barriers that women face compared to men when they are trying to enter the workforce. A big barrier that always comes to mind is childcare when we're talking about women entering the workforce. So we dug into that a bit more, and affordability was really the biggest issue that was coming up with why people cannot access childcare as they would like. So finally, we did ask citizens whether they had other female relatives in the workforce at any point. This was a select all type question, so regardless of if the relative was the mother, a sister, a cousin, an aunt, we asked people if they could name any of those relatives. And we did find that both men and women who have women in their lives, who have female relatives, who have held jobs in the past, tend to be more supportive of gender equality across a broad range of issues. And I'll go over many of these in this presentation. And to emphasize, women that have relatives, female relatives in the workforce, tend to be even more supportive of gender equality than women who themselves have held jobs in the past. So that was one of our more surprising findings. So the first question is, who are these women who work? We ask all our respondents to self-identify. So these are the selections we give, and you can see that across the region, most women, a plurality in nearly every country, self-identify as housewives. Kuwait is the exception. And that actually leads to a lot of results that make Kuwait look very different from a lot of other countries in the Gulf compared to the Lebanon, compared to the Maghreb. And we'll see some of that as we go. So for the first time, we asked people who do not say that they are employed or self-employed or retired if they've held jobs in the past. And you can see that, especially Tunisia, but in this presentation, we're going to focus on Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, and Kuwait. A lot of women, even though they do not currently identify as employed, have held jobs in the past, and these women who have held jobs in the past say that they would like to return to work in the future. So in total, if we take that women who currently work or who have ever held a job, we do see that there are quite a large percentage of women in the Arab region who have participated in the labor force at some point. And this is something we are exploring more both in the future and future waves, and how it affects views about labor force, politics, and home life. So we always ask various questions on what prevents women from joining the workforce in the first place. What are barriers that they face, and try to compare these to barriers men face. And you can see that lack of available jobs and low wages in particular do show up for both men and women, but it's very clear that men, it's a much more present barrier when people think of what's preventing men from joining the workforce. For women, they have a much wider, there's a much more diverse opinion on what barriers women are facing, which to us indicates that these are all very valid barriers that women are facing, and the barriers women are facing are there's many more of them than men are facing. So even though we have many of the same barriers, because we don't have the same amount of people choosing them over and over, we do see that there's a disparate impact of these barriers for women compared to men. Another thing you'll notice here is that only in Jordan and Tunisia does a lack of childcare options come in the top 3. But across the region, when we compare childcare, who is a childcare a barrier for, it's always women compared to men. So there is still a gendered aspect of childcare as a barrier, even if it's not necessarily the most top-of-mind barrier that women are facing. So to dig into this a bit more, we asked people, what is the biggest issue with childcare? Is there a reason we can't access it? Is it availability, expense, quality, or is it social stigma? Since this is obviously a barrier that women are perceived to have, is it a barrier because women shouldn't enter the workforce because they need to stay home? And we find this is not true largely. People are much more concerned about the cost of childcare. And this often comes in when you're weighing how much a woman is going to bring home from her career versus how much childcare is going to cost. This is a global issue, and we see that MENA is no exception. So when we do ask who in your family works, we see generally, again, the exception being Kuwait, that most people say that they don't have any female working family members. This was very consistent. These are the 4 countries that this presentation focuses on, but in the report, the larger report, you'll see across the region, Kuwait is the only country where most people say they do have a female working relative. So another interesting, so the graph on the left is if anybody has at least one female working relative. And again, we see most Kuwaitis have at least one female working relative. And then the graph on the right looks at who says this, men versus women. And we do see there is a difference between men and women who say they have at least one female working relative. And so I attribute this to a knowledge gap. So for instance, we see that married men are much less likely to say that their mother-in-law worked compared to married women who say their mother worked. And similarly, married men are much less likely to say their wife worked than married women are to say that they themselves have worked at some point in the past. So this is likely because men and women aren't necessarily talking about women's past employment. So I attribute this much more, not that people are lying, but that women talk about women's lives more. They talk about with their relatives, they talk with their friends about their mothers who have worked, their sisters who have worked, etc. And maybe their husband doesn't know that his mother-in-law held a job when she was in her 20s or something. So that does indicate, though, on the flip side, that men who do say that they have a female working relative are very confident that they have women in their family who have held a job. They know that this is true. And that's why in much of this analysis, we compare men who have at least one working relative to other, because it could be that they have female relatives, but that's just not in the workforce, but that's just not a conversation they're having. So how does this affect views on gender and the workplace? So this is the overall view. Kuwait is not in this graph because Kuwait, this is the first time the question was asked in Kuwait. But we do see a general decline or stagnation in opinions on whether men and women should have equal opportunities in the workforce. And this is true even when we break it up by gender. So Tunisia is a bit of a bright spot. We do see an increase in support by men for women having equal opportunities in the workforce. But even in Morocco, we see a drop among women as well as men agreeing that workplace opportunities should be gender neutral. And that's what it looked like over time. This is what it looks like today. We do see in general, and this is true with nearly every question that we ask related to gender politics or gender dynamics, that women are much more supportive than men are. And we see pretty significant gaps, even in Tunisia where we saw that increase. There's still a 13-point difference between men and women's opinions on workplace opportunities. At the same time, in Tunisia, for instance, we do see that if a female relative worked, people tend to be more supportive. And this is very true, obviously, in Morocco, and this is overall. Kuwait, again, is a bit of a special case because the people who don't have female relatives who work, it's a much smaller population, and that population is much different than the rest of the population in the Lebanon or the Maghreb or North Africa who don't have female relatives that work. So we can look at this with men in particular, and we do see that it will occasionally depend on who in your family is working. In Morocco, for instance, if your mother or sister worked, this has a greater impact on you than if it was any other female relative who worked. Whereas in Tunisia, if your wife or daughter worked, this has a greater impact on your opinions than if a different relative worked. So that's something very interesting that we dig into more in the report. And for women, we can see that really having a female relative that worked does not really influence your opinion as much in Tunisia or in Kuwait, but very much so in Morocco. And in Morocco, that's a much bigger differential among having a female relative who worked compared to if you yourself had a job in the past. So knowing someone who had a job, if you're a Moroccan woman, if you know your sister had a job, even if you had a job in the past, your sister having a job has a much more profound impact on your views of gender equality in the workplace than your own work experience. So moving on to family roles at home. Again, we see a bit of an increase or a stagnation at times in agreement with the statement, a man should have final say in all decisions. And again, this is reflected in both women and men. So this is the current status. Obviously, women are much less likely to agree. Men are more likely to agree, but this is a result of that overall trend. And again, if you have female relatives who have held a job at any point, in every country, you are less likely to agree that the man should have the final say. We can break this down again by who has worked when it comes to male citizens. And again, we see in Jordan here, a wife or daughter working has a much more profound impact than any other relative working. Whereas in Tunisia this time, it doesn't make as much of a difference who is working as long as you have a female relative who is working. And again, with women, in Morocco, we again see that having a relative that worked has that significant impact on your views compared to if you have had a view on the past. I'm going through quickly. I'm trying to get through all the points. So gender, this is the last section. Politics. Again, we see after a sharp drop, particularly in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Kuwait, in Jordan, we see a bit of a creep up again in agreement that men make better political leaders than women. And again, just like the previous trends, this is mirrored in both men and women across the region. So this is the current state. These graphs are looking pretty familiar at this point. Women are much less likely to agree, and then across the region again, very consistently, if you have a woman in your family who has ever held a job, again, this is any woman, your grandmother, your aunt, your sister-in-law, you are much less likely to agree that men make better political leaders than women. Similarly, this has the strongest trend with women, with your wife or daughter working and your views on politics. We very consistently see that if your wife or daughter has ever held a job and you're a man, you're much less likely to agree that women are not as good at political leadership as men are. And for women, again, we see these very big gaps. So this, the effect of having female relatives participate in the labor force, we really see is strongest when we talk about political opportunities for women in the workforce. And you can find more information on all of these topics in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, MaryClare. The data is fascinating, albeit a little depressing. The uptick that we're seeing in essence, backlash against progressive and positive gender norms. That being said, I think at the end of the report, which I read, last night or the past couple days, I do think you try to end on a little bit of a positive note, emphasizing how when there is, and we see this in the data, men who know and women who know another woman who's working, that, offers a little bit of a glimmer of hope. That being said, I will turn it over to the panel now to offer their initial reactions, in particular diving into Kuwait and why it might be the exception. But just in essence, to contextualize this data in a little bit of the political and economic situations you're each seeing in your countries of expertise. I will just go down the line. So Safa, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's an honor. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's such an honor. Very interesting report, very surprising, a little depressing, as you said, and concerning about the trend and how women issues are seen in the region. Kuwait was a surprise indeed for me. But I think Kuwait is a special case, and talking about Kuwait and why gender parity is doing much better there than in other countries, especially compared to North Africa. You go back to the discussion, what are the factors that make gender parity something possible in the region? Is it education? Is it more women in the workforce? Is it a question of resources? And when we talk about Kuwait, it is a question of resources because you can have the political will, you can have a very open population for gender parity, but then do you have the funds to invest in jobs for women? I think I did read about Kuwait. So most women tend to go for public sector, government jobs. These are jobs that provide flexible working hours. Childcare services are much more available for women. So sometimes it's in thinking about gender, equality at work, it's a question of resources. And I think countries like Morocco, Tunisia, which have definitely fewer resources compared to a country like Kuwait, it's how to prioritize your resources. For example, COVID-19 was a setback for a lot of people and definitely women in the region. And I think it's very important to have these programs, these gender parity programs, as part of economic recovery in the region, maybe working with international organizations, with donors. So it's very important to think about that. And
dark, divisive mode. Yeah, we'll grab some attention here in the.
And so it's very important to see how every country has specific circumstances and how to tailor solutions based on that. I think that's my take.
And then since we're talking about Kuwait already, I'd like to return to the question of Tunisia, but since we're on Kuwait, Kristen, do you want to tackle this?
Yeah, I think it's important just to understand the political economy. And like Safa said, Kuwait's very distinctive, or all the Gulf countries are distinctive, and that the way that they have enormous, historically, wealth that comes from, oil resources and other petroleum products. They sell those, and the wealth goes to the state, and the state basically distributes that wealth to the population through employment. That's the main way that they do that, or one of the main ways. So it's very common then for people to have government jobs. They're fully provided. I think the percentage of people working government jobs in Kuwait is like over 80-90%, so it's huge. So this is just kind of a norm that's been established. So certainly that economic wealth and the way that it's like shared by the state and the norms that the state put in place are very important. But I think it's also interesting to compare even across Gulf states, though, because if you brought in a state like Saudi Arabia, obviously they also had a lot of enormous wealth, maybe not as much wealth as Kuwait per capita for sure, but still enormous wealth. But the state itself put barriers to women participating in the workforce for a very long time. I mean, you had extremely strict gender segregation, and you had, some of the lowest labor market participation in the world. And it should be said that this happened despite the fact that the resources allowed the state across the Gulf countries to provide a really good education for the most part. Women were very highly educated, getting a lot of public services and this kind of things, but you can still have norms in place that are championed by the state that keep people from entering. So I think when you look at Kuwait, it's not only the resources, but the decisions that the state made, and the decision that the state made over time. And Kuwait is interesting because it was sort of the first Gulf state that kind of found that wealth and had a political system that allowed that to be shared and created ways to do that. So that Kuwait, when we look at it, these norms have been established over decades now, many decades, longer than in other Gulf states, which allows, I think that's also important to understand, is that over time, sometimes these things shift much more slowly, even if you have the economic ability to shift these things. Cultural norms and these sorts of things shift sometimes more slowly. And so that's just a few observations. I wanted also to just thank also MaryClare and to really, for this report, but also the Arab Barometer in general. I should say that I consistently use their work across a number of different topics, and they're just doing such tremendous work, really, going on the ground and seeing what people actually have to say about these things. And so I just wanted to thank you again for the report.
Of course. And I'll hand it over to Marissa, and then after that, I'd like to return to Tunisia a little bit more. Marissa?
Sure. Thank you so much, Faria, and thanks for the Arab Barometer for collaborating with us and launching this very important gender report here at the Wilson Center. I'm not going to touch upon Kuwait. I think both Safa and Kristen already did that, but I can zoom a little bit more into Jordan and perhaps a little bit on Lebanon, so like looking at the Levant. But with Jordan in particular, according to the World Bank, as well as various other studies as well, it consistently, unfortunately, has one of the lowest female labor participation rate for a country that's not at war. And of course, it is currently surrounded by war and has had multiple challenges, many external factors, from refugee crises to, of course, 20 years ago, the war in Iraq, etc. But the country has been stable. The economy has suffered in and out, but what was unfortunately very consistent was this not only low female labor participation, but also a bit of a slip over the last 10 to 20 years. And that's what we've also talked about in our reports, that the World Bank calls the MENA paradox, because as Safat mentioned, let's look at the different policies or factors that do lead to female labor participation globally. And, I'm constantly, reminded, but it's about education. And I think that in many parts of the world where there is a significant gap, a gender gap in education, that's the case. But in the case of Jordan, that's not the case, because there's very high literacy, first of all, amongst women. It's close to 90%. And women are outperforming their male colleagues in tertiary education. And it's not unique to the more feminine sectors, like the social sciences, for example. I don't think the social sciences are feminine necessarily, but I'm just saying that's how it's seen. Jobs like teaching, nursing, etc. Even in STEM, there are more women in STEM across the region than there are in the United States, for example. So that's where we have to look at other factors. And as you mentioned, MaryClare, when you asked that question, there was a variety of answers. But with Jordan, the top concern was childcare and the affordability. And I think that is a problem that the state needs to prioritize and work very closely with civil society organizations that are trying to have this discussion with the private sector, because there was a law that was reformed that basically enforced having a creche or basically childcare services in the private sector if you had more than 20 employees with a certain number of children. But of course, these companies and the economy is primarily comprised of small and medium businesses. So these companies decide, well, we will just not hire the 20th woman with a child. And that's where you see these discriminatory attitudes towards women who are, on their way to having a child or even getting married, and, the assumption is automatically that you're going to start a family. And so that's part of why we're also seeing this pushback. But I do want to mention that there are really important organizations working very hard to bridge that gap in not just in ensuring that we have more affordable childcare services, but also in bridging the gap in just discussing these issues openly with the private sector and the government, such as Sadaqa, that does a lot of really good work and taps into women in the community. They empower them to go and have these conversations with the businesses in their own community. We need more of this, but I think it's important, going back to Safa's point, political will is key. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. And Safa, I would like if you could just delve a little bit more into Morocco and Tunisia. Going back to contextualizing this, we saw, again, glimmers of hope in Tunisia. We saw a slight increase in general support for women's political leadership, and Tunisia as a whole has a longer history of being sort of at the fore of gender parity. In recent years, maybe not as much. But just put this all into context for us a little bit more. What does this mean in terms of both Tunisia and Morocco, and how does that longer history sort of play into these maybe slightly progressive attitudes?
So do people really change their minds? They go back? It's a very interesting question to be able to understand the region and these two countries. I do think there are for two reasons. First of all, job opportunities. The issues is for men and women. It's not just women having issues finding a job. And I do believe that when a society, even, it doesn't matter how liberal that society is, when there are issues finding a job, scarce opportunities, there is a sort of retrenchment. There is a sort of, these patriarchal norms resurface. I don't think, that's my shock, and they didn't go away. It's almost as like they fall back to those patriarchal norms. When men are the main breadwinners, they have to find jobs first. And then women comes. It's almost like it's not a necessity, it's just a privilege, that it doesn't matter if things go bad in a country. And I do believe that Tunisia has, there's like Arab Spring, all these economic, problems facing the country. Same thing for COVID-19 in Morocco. There's a lot of, there's a loss of jobs opportunities, especially in manufacturing, services, tourism, as well as years of drought. So there's a lot of loss of jobs in the agricultural sector. So that is, I think, for me, a best way to understand why there is this shift. It's just kind of a survival mentality. What really puzzles me the most, though, is how women are, there's some sort of internalized patriarchy, how women are actually saying that men have to be the sole source of decision-making in households. I really was trying to find an answer to that. We can all think about that. How do you change that? What happens? What makes women think that way? It is for me dangerous in a way, because women, this affects socialization process. They have kids. If they believe that, they will probably also influence the way young girls or young boys think about that. I think we still need more, awareness raising campaign. I don't know, really. I think we have to find ways to affect, impact, and change those kind of mindsets. But that's, to me, the issue that really is the most concerning for me.
Thank you, Safa. Just to delve a little bit deeper into this, I mean, combining what Marissa commented on, Kristen and you, Safa, it seems like for norms to change, there needs to be, it happens over time, generationally, it doesn't happen
Absolutely.
today or tomorrow, but B, it needs to hit this sweet spot of sort of political will, with capacity, with, exactly that, political will, capacity, and also grassroots and organization. And so considering this, in this strange interaction of these three factors, what exactly, and applying it to female labor force participation, what exactly needs to be done? We know what works. Childcare subsidies have been floated globally as a way to overcome one of these barriers, but we know, A, there's a myriad of barriers, and B, without political will, nothing will really change. So, again, given your three sub-focuses, what exactly needs to happen here?
I think time. We have to be patient. It's not something that is going to be solved overnight. Attitude shifts apparently slowly, and sometimes they regress and we go back. So I think we have to be more patient. I think there's also, I noticed in the last decade, there's a backlash. And I asked you, I told MaryClare, is there something people didn't tell you that you sense that they were not telling you? Because sometimes you ask people, and they don't really tell you exactly. So I was wondering if there's something that hasn't been said that you sense that people could have said that. Because, to me, there is a backlash. I'm Moroccan. Spent most of my years in Morocco. There is a backlash. Women, as you said, Marissa, there is this idea. So women are, they do well in high school. They're basically considered doing much, much better than boys. I think there is a sort of, this regression also, I think, can be explained by this backlash. Men feel that women are progressing, getting more education, getting more jobs, getting more independent. And I think men, the issue in Morocco, I don't know if about the rest of the region, it's really hard for them to catch up. And I'm saying this with the most neutral way. I think it's in a way to understand why there is this difficulty to change mindsets, because men are having a hard time catching up to the new reality. This creates really a major backlash towards women achievements, advancements. And that's why, to me, is in a way to understand why this kind of regression is happening. So I think we need more examples, more support for women, more women working, but there is no magic solution for me. It's a combination of everything. And I think we have to be able to use tradition. We have to be able to have compromise, religion. There's a lot of ingredients that have to be taken into consideration to be able to create that kind of magic potion to be able to make things happen for gender parity in the region.
I would like to say there are, as we've all seen, a lot of disappointing, perhaps, results, but some of the more hopeful results from our latest findings that I didn't have as much time to go over today is we do see political will for gender parity. So when we look at citizens, especially men who affiliate themselves with a political party, which is one measure of political engagement, or men who say that they follow politics, which is another question we ask, they are more likely to support gender quotas in parliament, in cabinet positions. They are more likely to say that having women in political positions helps advance women's rights. So there is a block of politically engaged citizens, if politicians did want to put forward, quotas or more actionable policies that bring women into politics, that bring women into the workforce, that would be, from our findings, that would be a very that would be politically favorable. That would be a very positive. They would have the support of those engaged.
Please go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, just to speak to those issues, I do think Saudi Arabia is really a fascinating case again, because, we did have a particular political economy system in place in Saudi Arabia that had very restrictive norms in terms of gender segregation, in terms of women's employment, that came from the state, it was directed from the state, but then was very much integrated into society more broadly. And more recently, of course, we've seen a very dramatic change from the leadership and what they want to see in that, so that post-2017, under the new leadership, there's a push now for women's participation in the labor force, and we've seen that grow dramatically. And again, I think that spoke to the latent ability that was already there. Women were being educated. There was, I think, too, a latent support for that, but that was not allowed sort of within the political system, so that when that barrier was released, then you saw the really rapid rise. I think I had a statistic which was crazy. I don't think if I have it right here, I'll find it in a minute. But it was over like 60-something% gain within like 2 years. Which is just enormous. And I think there is a cultural norm issue that goes along with that, though. Obviously, the state saying that, okay, we see things differently now, we want you to go in this direction, has a real impact if you have the economic circumstances that are following that as well. But there is a sort of latent discomfort with that shift, and this goes to the question that you were talking about. I think maybe this, or I feel my preferences or how I feel my norms are a little different, but I'm not too sure how other people feel about it, and especially if that's how the norms were set before. And there's a woman named, a scholar named Alessandra Gonzalez, who's been doing very fascinating research in Saudi Arabia, where she does kind of experiments, where she works within particular neighborhoods with men, and basically allows them in different settings, like, to know the preferences of their neighbors. And if you let them know that some of the neighboring men actually feel more liberal about letting their sisters or whatever work, like, everybody assumes like they shouldn't, nobody wants their sisters and stuff to work. But when she gets them in different settings and can see what the attitudes are, and then if she can share that, then it can rapidly shift the attitudes. And I found that really fascinating research that just shows you that sometimes it's not just that the attitudes are there, but also you need an environment where that can be expressed, especially amongst those that you care about the most, like sort of, that's why I really like that she was doing this in a neighborhood setting where it's like the people that you actually know and respect, so.
If I may comment on that exact point, because there was also a similar study that was conducted by some Swedish survey, or maybe Swedish professors, and discussed that there tends to be an over-exaggeration of what conservative social norms actually mean and look like. And part of that survey included actually Iran, which is obviously not part of the Arab Barometer, but that's exactly what they found, that most of the men said, well, there's this tension between the individual norms and the social norms. And in most cases, when these discussions take place, the social norms trump the individual norms because of this discomfort that Kristen was talking about. So this is why the encouraging these discussions in the media, in various fora, from the top, and encouraging this bottom-up approach as well is so important. I think, going back to MaryClare's sort of, silver linings that she also talked about, having a female relative that works does have a positive impact on how you view women working in general. That's why role modeling is so important. That's why, now the Olympics are taking place. We need to celebrate the athletes. We need to tell people who these people are, how their journey to the top, was framed. Like, all of these stories have to be told. So it's going back to a lot of role modeling and a lot of storytelling. There is this backlash that we've been discussing. And, I like this term that you mentioned, Safa, this internalized patriarchy, and I think some of it has to do with these structural challenges, these barriers, right? Because women in tough economic conditions, the priority will go, as you mentioned, for the male, figure as the main breadwinner. That's very much in line with these social norms. But there's also this sense that, well, if I don't have a conducive, family-friendly environment for me to work as a woman, then I might as well stay at home because I cannot do both. So that's also part of the pressure where, okay, I'll prefer to do this. I don't know that for sure, but I think in, conversations with friends and family, for me, born and raised in Jordan, back home, this is very much part of the narrative that it's too much work because it's not that the gender roles at home are changing. They're not.
Yeah, men are. Yes, definitely a matter of time, absolutely. And to your point, role modeling is very important. Recently, we had in Morocco female soccer. It's a thing now, and it's something that I would not imagine possible a few years back. And it's a sensation. Moroccan men, young people are cheering for these young, girls. And to me, it is such a huge change. And it's something that men and Moroccan society is celebrating. Soccer is a male sport in Morocco for many, many years. So to see this happening, change can happen almost in a way that even men are not paying attention to. So these women are celebrated, supported, and it's something that can be emulated to other experiences, to other, sectors. So it's very important. Men can be allies, and that could be one of the approaches to handle this issue of gender parity. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your comments. I'd like to briefly remind the online audience and in-person audience that we will be taking questions shortly. And for the online audience, you can just put those in the little chat at the bottom of the live stream. Before we turn to questions, though, not to editorialize, but I do think there's a very interesting study that's been done in the development and education fields that shows that for role modeling, there's something called positive deviance. Mm-hmm. And in positive deviance, they don't need to be, it's great that we have soccer stars, but women role models don't need to be, at the top of their fields. They can just be 5 degrees, or 10 degrees more progressive, and that makes actually, in fact, a bigger change on attitudes over time. Anyways, with that, we'll go in person first. If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand and use the mic, please.
Hi, my name is Liara Falk. I work for the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the State Department. And I'm curious about when you saw the differences, the countries where it made more difference if it was a wife or daughter versus someone else. If there's a chicken and egg thing going on there, like if those countries are more conservative in, I guess it's hard to tell which way goes first, but in positions in general around the workforce, and so those men were more likely to quote unquote allow the woman who they had control over to work, so then those women were more likely to work. Like if it's indicative of a broader, more regressive society, if it was specifically wives and daughters versus a woman who the man does not have direct control over.
Sure. So I didn't see anything like that based on a countrywide analysis comparatively. So there's a number of different ways to kind of assess how, open to gender equality a country is. I will say Tunisia and Lebanon tend to be at the forefront of gender equality being widely accepted. What I do see really pretty consistently is an interaction between education and income. And we do see women who have jobs tend to be more well-educated and tend to be better off. So on one hand, that may make sense. On the other hand, you might think that if a family is struggling to cover their bills every month, you would want who's ever working to work, but that's really not what we see. But even when we take into account, so these are, the overall graphs, but I have run several different statistical models. There are the impact of education and income still don't account for this, for the positive change completely between men in particular who have women who work in their family and who don't. So even if we control for a man being more or less educated, for having more or less income and being more comfortable, we still have men who are much more pro gender parity if they have women in their family who work. And you're right, it is fairly endogenous, and that is one of the reasons this question was added to the survey, was because there was a study, I believe it was in Jordan, and it looked at men whose mothers worked were more likely to have wives that worked. So they were more open to having a working wife if their own mother worked. And that's also why I tried to compare the wife-daughter to mother-sister, because even if men don't have control, quote unquote, and we don't have, information on how old their daughter is, if they've left the family, but there's still influence, there's still an idea that if they have their mother or their sister, they've grown up in that environment, so they might be more accepting of their wife or daughter working. But we do really still see that distinction where if it's someone that they are even closer to, so I kind of conceptualized it as you have a closer, more day-to-day life with your wife or daughter now than your mother or sister, that does tend to have a bigger impact. So I do think it's, there is an element of what you grew up in, if you're a man, if you're accepting of your wife or daughter working, and there is evidence that, and that's one reason why I focused on the impact of men. When men are more accepting in general of gender parity, it matters more almost, because they do, you're right, make a lot of decisions about whether you can go get a job or not. So it's something we'd like to dig into a bit further, but so far it seems to be just knowing someone in your family still has an impact, regardless of how close they are to you. It might be a bigger impact if it's your wife or daughter, but still, if you know any female relative and you're a man that works, you tend to be more accepting of gender parity in general.
Great. Right here?
My name is Faisal Awartani from Palestine. I teach at Arab American University of Palestine, and I would like to thank the Arab Barometer for providing the data, the raw data, because I let my students use it for their projects. I teach quantitative research methods, and I also run my own company, Insights for Research, where I do a lot of surveys on public perception towards women work in Palestine and in the region, of course. And it was really fascinating, the amount of reflections that we get from such surveys, especially when we ask people about their what kind of jobs they like women to work. And it was very interesting. Of course, in Palestine, what topped the list was nurses and teachers and head of state as well. It was large. So, but taxi driver did not make it, so it was very low. And it was the other fascinating question that I'd like to share with you is when we asked women, what kind would you prefer, a female boss or male boss? The large majority said male. So that was really, I know, to me it was really interesting. But I would like also to maybe the data that you presenting, one also can dig into it in terms of doing some causal inference and doing some multivariate analysis, where you can really find extra insight on how to understand what's happening exactly. And of course, some of the behavioral economics theories can justify some of the results that you have. And of course, I would like to support Marissa's point, the idea of education. And one of the things that I would like to see also, looking at the countries and whether they have introduced civic education in their programs or not, and see how the perceptions are related to the inputs of the educational system. This is something I would like to see, and we can possibly do something with the Arab Barometer on this issue. Thank you. Thank you. Very good presentations. Thanks.
May I just say something here? You raise a very good point, Faisal, about how, civics education, but also what is the education system producing? Like what mindsets is the education system producing when it comes to gender parity? So there was a contextual analysis of Jordanian textbooks about 10 years ago that looked at, I think, grades 5 to 7. And it was fascinating that when it comes to women's reproductive and health issues, health, reproduction, and family life, it was gender positive. But when it came to workforce, it was gender negative. And it was exactly what you were mentioning, what jobs do you prefer to work in? These are the images that students are seeing in their textbooks. They have pictures of women nurses, male engineers, female teachers, male scientists. So these do make a difference, going back to imaging and storytelling and role modeling. And then there were some interesting questions that were introduced as part of critical thinking. So if the woman's work if a woman has a child and this will interfere with her work, what do you think women should do? And of course, when you have this very positive framing of women's important reproductive rights and reproductive roles, then of course they're going to say, of course, she needs to stay home and take care of the children. So even the framing of some of the so-called critical thinking questions are not necessarily helping or shaping mindsets that are more leaning towards gender parity.
So I think also this adds a point to the idea of tracking teachers' mindset in terms of gender. That is important, like specialized surveys. And one other question that we asked in our survey for males is that would you prefer to have to marry a working woman or someone that is not working? And the majority were saying working woman. So that was.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'm Tulin Delolo. I was just, going to ask on that, and the question was, what frames today's social structure that allows this gender segregation? Is it, I assume that this changes from time to time. So if there is a change, where did it change from and what it become? Is it a mental issue, emotional issue, religious issue, or is it now widely a security dilemma? What it is that you believe that feeds this social structure now in 2024? Thank you.
Anyone is welcome to take it.
Well, as I mentioned, I think there's always a dynamic, right? There's an interaction. So you have sort of state policies that I think in most of these states, we're talking about authoritarian states, so they're really setting the norm for the entire society. And they're also having control of their educational system and all of these sorts of things. So I think that the state level choice of leadership is critically important in all of these. But of course, the state is also responding to some degree about what they're finding already within society. But sometimes there can be a lapse, and that's why I think, again, Saudi Arabia is a very interesting country. And when you look at the dynamics, you had a long process where The state was sort of starting to shift the openness, sending a lot of people abroad, for instance, under King Abdullah, sending hundreds of thousands of people, not a small amount of people abroad. Also just the opening in information systems where people could see much more broadly kind of international norms or global norms or different norms, was probably having an impact within society that wasn't revealed. That's what I'm saying. As much. So, there wasn't, the authority was still not allowing that, or in a way it wasn't seen as socially kind of acceptable. So it's an interesting and very complicated dynamic. And I wanted to mention too, the question that was asked earlier about these kind of patriarchal norms, there's often a lot of contradictions in that. And I think some of the research, MaryClare, that you did that we didn't talk about as much today was on the political leadership or women in leadership kind of issues. And I found that really fascinating too, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you were finding is that there's a big, strong majority of people thinking that men are better. Even if women are participating, there's still this attitude. And there's a woman, Rana Motowa, who's Emirati, that did some really interesting research in the UAE. And of course, this is a country that's really pursuing this sort of state feminism, right, where they're trying to put women in these high positions, putting women in a lot of positions of sort of like government ministers and this sort of thing. So you might think, again, putting them in these examples, that shifting attitudes. And I think to some degree it is, but when she looked at she was doing interviews with college students and stuff, and it was interesting that they still thought that men were better leaders. And it's interesting because you have basically not a shift in the patriarchal norms, which I think was the question earlier was asked. So the leader can put these women in these positions of power and stuff, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the overall patriarchal idea of society and who makes the better leader and head of households and stuff isn't necessarily shifting even when you see these big shifts at the top. So I think these whole issues of kind of norms and stuff are very complicated ones that work through political decisions, but then how those work their way through social norms and of course the economy, which again, that's another issue that I really, that question of economic competition, I kept wanting to see the numbers in each of these countries, like where the job factors and the economy was doing relative to each of them, to see those shifts, because the shifts that you saw were not, it wasn't like over decades. You had shifts, you had a positive trend, like post-pandemic, that's now shifted. So that's a short-term thing, so it may be.
But maybe the effect, the aftermath.
Yeah, maybe, but I think that shows you that there's a lot of factors that go into it.
To answer your question, it is a multifaceted issue, and the solution is not one solution necessarily. The political will, again, matters. The issue of quota is very fascinating for me because I remember when I was growing up, I was talking to my dad about quota. He doesn't believe in quota system, not because he's misogynist, but he just believes that quota system produces an elite women who are basically part of the system. They're not representative of the women. They preserve the system. They are privileged, and they don't necessarily do their job. They're just there because they happen to be women. That is a huge problem. But even at that age, I told him I still want to see a woman minister. I know it's very interesting. How do you look at it? So in Morocco, there is for the first time a woman finance minister. I think that's huge. Is she a good finance minister? It depends on the technicality, but it's about having women there to open the way for other women to be able to say that I can be a finance minister or I can be a prime minister. It also shifts the attitude of male population seeing women in that kind of position and make things possible, even humanize I don't like humanize, but it makes it possible even to perceive, which sometimes it's hard even to do in those kind of issues. I think, so quota system is very, very interesting, but I think still we do need it. So Morocco has a quota system in local councils, in parliaments. They had recently this law for publicly traded companies where they have, I think they are working on 40% of appointing women in managerial positions by 2027. Does it solve the problem? No, but it does, is a start. It's one of the solutions that we can have for this issue. It's just very complicated, and you need education, you need to provide enough jobs for everyone. So I think it's just like a very complicated, but issue that needs different solutions.
Thank you, Safa. And well, we got one question from online that I actually think is a very good question to end on, and it's quite interesting. It builds on what everyone was talking about role modeling, the debates within role modeling, whether or not this can be a top-down sort of push, or how, when it is a top-down push, that it might not trickle down to societal levels, as Marissa and Kirsten were saying. So the question from online that I would like to pose as our closing is, what might meaningful engagement of male community members, male allies, look like in efforts to improve policies and norms that facilitate increased female labor force participation? So looking at that specifically male audience, we know role modeling works for women by and large when they know other community members who are working, who are in leadership. But with men, as MaryClare also found in her report, what can be done to sort of push that trend?
I'll be brief with this. I think we can go back to some of the interventions from the international community in a lot of the MENA region, less so in the GCC because they have their own resources. But there's so much emphasis in these development programs on capacity building for women, a lot of role modeling, storytelling of women amongst women. And that's where the missing piece is, that the conversation is not being had with male colleagues or, young men and boys. And so including the conversation about masculinity with the conversation about feminism is important, because the masculine patriarchal mindset is also creating a lot of pressures for men. If the young man is seen within this particular sociocultural context as the main breadwinner, but he cannot find a job, that adds a lot of pressure. And I think this is why we need to re-examine these definitions in the context of these different locales. Each country has its own, sociocultural mix as well. And I think that's where we need to think about that a little bit more, particularly in conversations with, AID and other donor organizations.
Anyone has anything to add, please?
Just a small observation with that. We were talking before the panel about, we're talking here about the Arab world and this backsliding and stuff, but we should probably include that these are global phenomenons as well. Yeah. You could see some of those same statistics if we were to look at our own country. And I would also just mention working in the Gulf, which is a region where the information environment is so, in a way, very open. I mean, the technology is extremely high, extremely spread across, so that, you have huge numbers. I mean, 80-90% of people are using social media or something, of the population are using it. That a lot of these discussions are happening across communities. It's not like we're doing something over here and they're doing something there. I mean, when I think about some of these people, you talk about the backlash and this kind of new questions about masculinity, you have these figures like Andrew Tate, I don't know if you guys follow this kind of stuff, or someone like that who's really uber masculine. I mean, he went and took up residence in Dubai for a while. I mean, this is basically somebody that's an international character that has huge appeal in the Arab world too. So I think a lot of these dynamics are actually happening on a global level, which is something kind of interesting, sometimes disturbing to look at, but something that we should be paying more attention to.
I think social media is something that we haven't discussed, and it's huge in the Arab world as is across the world. So you have these women who are influencers, who have a lot of money, who are basically in Morocco, and I think in different countries across the region, they say, why do we need men? What are these men are providing us? So it creates, so these men find themselves in a very vulnerable position, and it accentuates that kind of backlash between men and women in the region. I think the same thing for men. This is from my observation, there is no scientific basis, but this is the conversation. It is as significant, not necessarily scientific, but you can see the sentiment in the region in different countries. So men are, my observation, so men, they say, I'm not going to marry a woman who has a job. And then on the other side, it's like women have to also provide, be providers, basically partake in household expenses. So men are also not really, are we being conservative? Are we, or at the same time, they want women to be part of shared responsibilities, financial responsibilities. So I think we are witnessing recalibration of gender relations. That's what I'm sensing. There is a transitional. Men are still, they hold on to that traditional role models, but at the same time, they want to take what works for them. So they want to be still basically making up most of the decisions, but also they want women to be part of to be sharing the financial responsibility. So it's still, I think we're just recalibrating. We'll see where we are going to be. So I think that's something that we can add to the conversation as well.
Please, you get closing thoughts, MaryClare.
And I just wanted to, I think these are all great points. I want to thank our panelists, and I wanted to plug the data in general. It will be released likely in October. Like I said, we're finishing up getting Iraq involved and cleaning that up. But we do have data on social media use, what social media platforms are used, what it's used for, how much time people spent on it. We also have a whole section on discrimination. So I'm an academic at heart, and it's very hard for me to cut information out of my reports. But something that didn't make it in is that we do see everybody thinks someone else is getting a job instead of them. So when we ask how likely is it that a less qualified male will get a job instead of you or a family member, it's actually just as high as when we asked how likely do you think it is that a less qualified female will get a job instead of you. So it's really there, we don't see evidence in our survey at least of people fearing losing out to a job to a woman versus a man. Just anybody is going to take your job. And we also have a section on marriage expectations and partners. We don't ask about employment, but that would be great in the future. But we do ask about religious adherence, and we ask about income. And we do see that the expectations for a male relative marrying someone are a bit higher than if your female relative is marrying someone. So when we ask, a man or a woman in your family getting engaged to someone who's more or less religious, has a higher or lower social status, it matters more to people generally when it's their male relative. And social status tends to matter a bit more than religious status. You can think of it, can you influence more, perhaps? But there's all of that and more in the data that is coming out, and I'm happy to preview any results. I have a hard time shutting up about it. So thank you, all of you, for having me and joining this panel. But yeah.
Of course, thank you for the report. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for their wonderful remarks today. As a reminder to both in-person and online audiences, the data is coming out in October, but the report has been launched today. It's linked on the event page, as well as on Arab Barometer's site. I'd highly encourage everyone to read it. There's a lot that we didn't cover that is in the report, including women's political leadership, quotas, and more. And with that, again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. I'm Faria Nasruddin, the Program Associate for the Middle East Program, and have a great day.